Hi, everybody. Welcome to Us and Flux Conversations from the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University. My name is Bob Beard. I'm a project manager here at the center where we use the tools of speculative fiction to get people thinking more optimistically about the future. And we started Us and Flux a few months ago as a response to the turbulence and uncertainty of world events. And unfortunately, our world continues to be even more fraught today. Nevertheless, we hope these short stories and events about community, collaboration, and collective imagination might help folks think outside their own perspectives, inspire new dialogues, or perhaps just provide a bit of an escape. The latest story for Us in Flux was published last Thursday, June 11th. Notice is a piece from Sarah Pensker. Sarah is the author of more than 50 works of short fiction, including the novelette Our Lady of the Open Road, the winner of the Nebula Award in 2016, and Enjoy, Knowing the Abyss Behind, the winner of the Sturgeon Award in 2014. Her novel, A Song for a New Day, was just honored with the 2019 Nebula Award for Best Novel. She's also a singer and a songwriter with 3 albums on various independent labels, the third with her rock band, The Stalking Horses. We're going to talk more about her new story for Us in Flux in just a bit. And if you haven't read it, it's short. Please feel free to go to csi.asu.edu/usinflux, open it up, and follow along. And to chat with Sarah about the story, we invited our colleague, Dr. Punya Mishra, to the chat. Punya is the Associate Dean of Scholarship and Innovation and a professor in the Division of Educational Leadership and Innovation in the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University. One breath, I did it. Dr. Mishra's work focuses on better understanding the role and nature of creativity in teaching and learning contexts. So thank you both for being here, and thank you all for watching. So we're going to get started. If at any time you have questions, please go ahead and put those down in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get those going throughout the conversation. So first of all, Sarah, hi. I wondered if you might give an overview of the story for folks who may not have read it yet.
Sure. Like you said, it's super short. It's a story about a young man living in a separatist community that discovers he gets mail for the first time, and it's a third notice for something that he hadn't seen the first 2 notices for, in which he is supposed to be registering for a sort of draft. The government says that he needs to be registering for for transformative services, and it's just a story about him trying to figure out what that is and what it means, and what questions, what's been hidden from him by his community, what he still needs to be asking, and that sort of thing. That was my really short version. I might have missed some stuff.
Well, that's on our audience to catch up on. But no, I think that's a great overview. And Punya, how does Sarah's story reflect the work that you and your colleagues are doing around what you call learning futures?
Thank you, Bob. Lovely to be here, Sarah, to have this conversation. So in the College of Education, one of the things that we have been sort of thinking a lot about, and again, those issues I think have come even more to the forefront given the COVID-19 and the other stuff that's happening in the world around us today, is how do we think about sort of the future of learning? What would learning look like? How do we build organizations which are more resilient, which when changes happen, and again, I mean, COVID-19 is just one example of many, but if you look at sort of the inequities in society, if you look at the advent of machine learning and AI, there's going to be significant transformational changes. So we've been trying to build sort of programs and programming for school leaders and educators to think about these things. However, a lot of those things become very, instrumental in nature. And one of the things that fiction does, I think, is allow us to explore sort of the human dimension of that, allow us to get deeper into sort of values which make conflict, which I think this story offers that in a very powerful and a beautiful way, is how these different conflicts can play out at the level of the individual. And so to us to be a part of sort of the Us in Flux and this flash fiction series is partly that, is that how can we go from thinking about, we can have workshops about learning, what does machine learning going to mean for student achievement and personalized learning, but it's one more thing to think about it from sort of that human perspective. So, our work around learning futures and principled innovation, I think this is just a powerful space for us to engage in this conversation, to have these discussions. And through that, maybe imagine new ways that we can think of tools, technologies, pedagogies, approaches, and so on.
Yeah, so I wanna talk a little bit about values and choices, because that's what this story is sort of built on. And it's you see choices all throughout the story. Not only the options that are afforded to Malachi, when he gets this unexpected piece of mail, and then those various decisions that we see him contend with as sort of he asks one question and it opens up another series of questions. But he's also contending with the values and choices that are at the center of the two communities that he's encountering, right? The commune that was set up as a counter to commercialism and waste and globalism, and then this transformative service corps, which is a broad government-based intervention to bring people back into the fold. So I wondered if we could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, I was kind of playing with the idea of, I never liked the stark black and white, so I didn't want to make an evil separatist community. Like they're doing okay for themselves, and they've made these decisions, and it's not awful. He's kind of chafing a little bit. He's also 18, and I think 18. 18 or 19, and he's 19. 19, sorry. And trying to figure out himself. And so I wanted to put that context of trying to figure out when you've only known one thing, and then seeing that there is a wider world and that there are other choices, so I thought I would pose as another option an organization that was at least attempting to address some of those things, bring people in to a more to a larger community-minded sense. So you can be community-minded, but only address your own small community, and then you can also step out and look at how you can help others. And so I had this idea of I mean, there are other service corps. There are service corps that exist now, but I thought a broader mission and a mandatory mission, with some definite rewards attached to it, that would maybe get more people interested, even if it is mandatory. So I was playing with all of that stuff in a very small space.
So I think that's, if I can jump in here, what really stood out for me in the story was, because every text has like shades of everything else that you've ever read before. So I could see the commune and I could see this larger governmental thing, both in positive and negative ways at the same time. And I think what the story does really well is doesn't give you too many clues either way. Because my first response when I was the governmental thing was like, oh, this is going to be, the stereotypical big brother, governmental, whatever. But then I go back and read it again, and it's not that. I mean, the person who's sort of responding to them is very excited by the idea. The male person, the mailman or woman who comes and says that, oh, this was great. And then of course you understand that within the commune there are these positive things, as well as there is some repression in the sense of that you don't get to see your mail, for instance. And so it was, to me, that and this young man trying to navigate between them, I think was what made the story very resonant, because it didn't make a call one way or the other for each, which I thought was like a powerful sort of way of presenting that, of these two different value systems, which are very similar, but also very different in many ways, right?
Yeah. There was some uncertainty with, Malachi getting the letter, and I think we can get into that in a bit, but just to, as you said, Sarah, there are these, for lack of a better word, like transformative service corps, right? There are these public service initiatives. And I think like right now in sort of, when college is being disrupted for many students, they might be thinking about doing a gap year. And so in this story, it's sort of like a mandatory gap year. But, I wonder how the two of you think that, this type of an experience could fit in with secondary and post-secondary and higher education.
it I mean, I think it's an idea that would have potential there, especially with as broad a mandate as they had. Like they could be, the fact that it can cover such a breadth of experiences, so it could encompass, you know, part of what I was thinking of when I first started writing it was actually contact tracing, that there, you know, that people could do contact tracing if they, and then we would be doing better on that front than we currently are. But I wanted it to be something where everyone could find a place. So I put in, I think I included citizen journalism, and I think there's space for teaching and firefighting, and some of it kind of crosses over with stuff that AmeriCorps does, or maybe Teach for America. There are things that exist already, but I thought that if you could get into all those realms and find something for everyone, and then say, you have to go out and do this.
I think the other piece that stood out there was a sort of a universal basic income theme there as well. You know, that once you do this for a year or two, I don't remember exactly what the duration was, then you have a certain income coming in. And that's, again, another theme that seems to be, which, again, as we look at sort of the workforce of the future, and we look at the gig economy, and we look at, you know, machines and, you know, automatically driven cars and all of that stuff, you're looking at significant disruptions to what we have taken to be a pretty standard industrial, post-industrial economic model. So there are those elements of that I felt as well, which is kind of interesting to me. But I think the other piece that I was sort of intrigued by was even just the title, Transformative Service Corps. And it's this wonderful array of words which sounds very governmentalese at some level, and at a time when one sort of questions, you know, like, you know, what words mean and what they signify versus what the, you know, I felt that was a really nice touch, because it both sounds helpful, but it sounds like one of the big, you know, which is seeking to transform you. And, you know, should we be entering into that pact or not? You know?
Right. It could potentially be very ominous, actually, if you don't, right. I mean, if you object to transformation, then that's not a good thing. You know, then this isn't necessarily the organization you want to hear from, and it can mean it could mean any number of things depending on how they used it. And in a bad system, you know, it has potential to go wrong. So in the story, it's been around for 20 years, like so I wanted to establish it, so it didn't seem like it was coming out of nowhere, that he hadn't heard of it, but that didn't mean it didn't have a history already. But it had come into existence after his commune had long been established. So they had made up their minds about it, and they had made up their minds about what their youth would be doing regarding it. But I wanted it to have a sense of it could go either way. And originally I had actually, my draft title had just been the title of the organization, and the people I showed it to actually decided that it was ominous. They just automatically assumed that was bad from the way that it was used as a title. Uh-huh. And I realized that if I wanted those shades of gray, and I wanted it to potentially be a positive model, then I wanted to pull that back. So I went for the title Notice instead, because of the multiple notices he'd received, but also the wake-up call that it caused, the fact that it was making him notice things and ask questions that he hadn't asked before. So I wanted to use notice, and once I had notice on multiple levels, I decided it actually worked a lot better.
Yeah, I was one of the readers that got a sense of dread from the TSC, and so, you know, as much as I wanted to sort of root for them and you know, think of them as, you know, beneficent, you know, there was that sort of like, there's a little bit of unease, and I think that there was the sense of that the TSC might be subject to the sort of the same sort of dogmatism as Malachi's commune, if it's allowed to go on for a few generations. You know, you see that Malachi is bristling up against the restrictions of the commune, and then you have, you know, sort of the very chipper operator of the TSC repeating sort of the line that's on the envelope. So it all seems sort of like propagandized. So, and we do find out that they are, that they are a force for good in this young man's life. But I wonder, Punya, from a knowledge and learning perspective, especially as the sort of the ethos of this organization was to ask the next question. Is there a way to train against like the constraints of a system, the sort of like conditioning that this is the only way to do things?
So I think that's a great question, because one of the things that we always get, like in education in particular, is you get pockets of innovation, you get pockets where you see really interesting things happening, which really empower kids to learn, to grow, to develop in powerful ways, becoming better citizens, becoming more knowledgeable, and so on. And it's when you start to scale, and what happens then is that processes start trumping, the best of intentions. And once things become, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we face in education. I think one of the things that we've been engaged in some conversations, both within our college and outside of it, is that in what ways does this COVID-19 crisis, because we suddenly have 97% of the kids in the world out of school. Mm-hmm. Now, this is not to minimize what a lot of kids who are maybe, let's say, I'm originally from India, in India or in South Africa or other places which don't have internet access, this, that, and the other are going through in terms of being deprived of education. But this does allow us, for once, to ask some fundamental questions about what the role of school is, what the role of school is within a community, what the role of parents are within, one of the pieces I wrote recently is that the single biggest thing schools do is give kids daycare so that parents can keep the economy humming. I mean, that's something we don't often talk about, right? And so, I mean, the commune, for instance, that requires a significant commitment by all the adults that they are going to be responsible for this. Well, if you look at the TSC structure, that's like, oh, we will help you develop your kids. Now, that's a very different transaction or relationship with development and growth. And I think that's a fundamental tension in all educational settings. Is like, where do we draw the lines? What's the system? What's the scale? How much is there unified, sort of one kind of a structure? How much is variation allowed within that? I think those are very powerful questions. And I think the two cases here sort of speak to two different extremes in some way, right? Of that continuum.
Yeah, and as we're talking about asking questions, I'll remind our audience that the Q&A feature is open. And Paul has a follow-up question on this, which I think we've already got to a little bit. But, talking about the role of educators in possibly challenging community values. And also for Sarah, this is from Paul, how do you see your role in teaching and possibly challenging community values?
Hi, Paul. As a I'm a writer, and I have also started dipping a toe into teaching fairly recently. But I think as a writer and as a songwriter, there's a different role that you get to play where you can sort of play with those questions without necessarily giving definitive answers, but give people more questions to ask and show them possible futures. So when we talk about challenging community values, I think about the ways that we get to write new communities and set people up in them and see how they work, and then walk them through. For some reason in my head, instead of picturing stories right this second, I'm picturing Sims, like little computer characters, but we do get to play with it in a different way as writers of possible futures versus creators versus people who actually enact those things. And then when you put on that teaching hat, then you get to do it more concretely, because you get to put those ideas into, that the heads that those things are going into are the heads of younger people who may have different and better ideas than you have and may get a chance to enact them. So giving them those tools to look critically at the systems that they've arrived into.
Mm-hmm. Great.
So if I can just add a little bit, I think the point that you made, Sarah, about the title of the story, Noticing or Notice, but the emphasis on this one aspect of it is learning to notice or learning to see. And I think that as an educator, that to me is the biggest role that we can play, because it's not my idea of community or your idea of community or the student's idea of community. It's more of like, can we equip them with the mindsets, the tools, the ways of looking at the world that allow them to question things, allow them to notice things. I think the biggest challenge we face is that we just take things for granted, right? So, I mean, if you look at the structure of school today, why do we have 50-minute periods, right? I mean, there was a reason for it, but there's no reason it needs to be the same way. And but if we start thinking of school or learning in traditional sort of setups, we are going to always end up with the same solution that we have now. So being able to notice, being able to ask questions, to me as an educator becomes the more important thing. And what emerges out of that, that's okay. But it's not imposing a point of view. It's like allowing people the freedom to, and that's where I think fiction comes in. You know, I think fiction allows for that playfulness, which otherwise, you know, it's harder to sort of do.
I think this is a good place to sort of talk about craft a little bit. You know, the writing craft, and I mean, we've said this a couple times. This is a very short piece, but the world that we see, just the small sort of glimpse of it, is really compelling. And so, you know, I wonder if we can just talk a little bit, you know, get deep in the weeds about the construction of an idea at, you know, at this scale. Like how do you do what you do, Sarah?
You for a story of this size, you usually have to sort of jump in the middle, so you don't get to show the founding of the commune or the transformative services, and you don't even get to show the result necessarily. You don't get to show the end result of his choice. So a flash piece is usually a moment in time, and you often think about it as the most important moment in that person's life. Is usually a good place to build a flash story around something that is the cusp of change for a character. And within that, so you have this really compressed time period. You can use, I think there was a lot of use of specific nouns in here, like giving the commune a name, giving the organization a name, both of which spoke to something, giving tiny little examples of changes in the society at large. So that people can see that it's not the world that we're in, like little hints that it's not the now, and then there's sort of stuff on a deeper sort of syntactical level where you can there's stuff that you have to necessarily skip. There's some things that you have to assume that the audience will picture for themselves. You don't do a lot of very detailed descriptions, and then playing with words, just like getting things to the point, but allowing Malachi the moment that he needs to unpack things himself, and letting those moments of unpacking take up more space than they might otherwise.
Yeah, you see those moments where he's really processing, right? And these sort of ideas and questions and notions are just sort of like tumbling from him. So it's a really interesting way that you've done that with language and with his internal thoughts. So yeah, kudos. It's fascinating, and it is very short. I wonder also, you know, as you said, you know, these things are in the future, but not, you know, super far into the future. Like we're seeing things like universal basic income. We're seeing, you know, guaranteed jobs. Like we're seeing these ideas at least sort of bandied about. So like, how much were you sort of rooting for the TSA to, you know, or the TSC, excuse me, to grow out of this this situation? Do you think it's plausible?
I mean, I think I do think it's plausible. Actually, I think that well, first of all, universal basic income. I work that into any number of stories because I actually think anytime I'm writing near future, I think it's an idea we really have to be addressing, and I like it as a tool because it allows things to open up a little for characters also, both as a tool and as a real life thing. I think it would, the places that it's been used, it has been shown to work. So I'm in support of that, and I'm Canadian-ish, so I support the healthcare measures that are in the story too. And I sort of got lost in the question and have totally forgotten what the question part of it was.
No. Punya, what do you think?
Yeah, so I actually, I mean, I just want to point out the when you talked about the nouns, there were some nouns in there. I mean, there was this one throwaway line about, oh, the last time you used a phone when he had called the Reliance, some agency with their, what was it, water pump backpacks. I just love that water pump backpacks because you sort of see it, but you know, why that? Why not the fire truck? I mean, you know, just ask this question of you. But I'm always very curious. This is just a selfish curiosity about how a story or something like this goes from an idea that's in your head to like, oh, I have to write this 1,500 word story, to becoming a first draft, to evolving over time, the nuance. At which point do you feel like you have something and now it's polishing and putting in the water pump backpack or, you know, whatever, just to make it a little more real? I'm just very curious about that process. So could you talk about how this idea sort of started, where it started from, and how it sort of mutated, or did it not? Maybe it didn't. Maybe it came fully formed in some way. I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, first of all, it was a little bit of a challenge because I had just come off of editing a novel, and going back from a novel to a flash piece was like trying to get a parachute into into like a jewelry sized box, like it just wouldn't fold again. So there was a little bit of a challenge there, but I think at the time I started thinking about it, I was thinking about contact tracing, and I was thinking about all of my students and the question of you know, what do you do with this time? And so I was playing with those things, and the organization came first, and I thought I want to explore this idea, and then I realized that in that amount of space, I didn't have room to show them very much, and also I didn't have room. I liked them, and I didn't. And when you like something, it's hard to create the conflict. So finding room for. Like it's great when you have a character who doesn't know something like Malachi, then you have an opportunity to show it for the first time in a world where probably everyone who isn't growing up on a commune knows that when they, you know, when they turn a certain age, they're going to get the envelope, or they're going to probably get an email, which he couldn't get either, or a phone call or whatever, but they're going to get contacted, and they're going to go do this thing, and it's already part of their worldview, and having a. So my first thought was, what character can I generate that would not have this as part of their worldview, so that I can introduce it to them. And then the question with writing near future is always, where is the conflict? And so then you start my usual method. And I'm actually teaching a class, I believe, at Clarion West coming up, like a one-time class that will be about creating near future stories. But part of the question for near future that I always ask is, who would be helped the most by this, and who would be harmed the most by this? And you start making lists of those things, and what could go right and what can go wrong. So I had these long lists of, you know, how would this work for, and I thought about different disabilities, and I thought about, so I have this whole list of you know, basically an FAQ for the organization ready at hand, but for a short piece like this, for a flash piece, part of the question is just, how can I get in there, explain the organization, introduce a conflict, and then get out again. It's all sort of built around that. And the best I could figure out was one moment of self-discovery for a character.
That's so cool. I love that, because I always find that so fascinating. And now the story is, the TSC is one component of a much bigger landscape that's evolved. But that's where you started from. And hopefully, I hope that it finds a space in some other thing that you write in the future.
Yeah.
Which is not 1,500 words long.
Right. I always feel guilty when I'm a big fan of short fiction in general. So I sort of feel like I'm betraying short fiction when I expand a short piece that is meant to stand on its own into a novel or into a series of short pieces, because ideally it should stand and it can just sit there as a piece about that. And it can, and I might leave it forever, but I'll admit that I'm playing with it right now in my head.
Cool. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, I love this, the meandering way in which these things work. And I also love the sort of the constraints of the form that guide the final solution that emerges, and your intentions and the intentions of the words and the form pushing against each other. I just love that whole process. So thank you for sharing that.
Oh, you're very welcome. So I think I come up with the ideas and then I give them to you, I hope, and then your department gets to seed them into the youth, and then
there you go.
So Nadia actually in the Q&A had a question that sort of gets to this. Malachi is making the call to join the Transformative Service Corps, where presumably he'll be taught a set of skills that he can take out into the world. But for Punya, how do we teach people to be creative or to be innovators? With somebody that's working in this area, how do you design formal interventions for learning that go beyond just teaching a discrete set of skills?
So one of the things that has always intrigued me is this moments in history that you suddenly find a crazy flowering of creativity, right? You look at the late 19th, early 20th century. I mean, you had transformations in science and art and literature, music. Or if you look at the birth of the United States, where suddenly you had sort of this flowering of political talent, right? I mean, and so I've always felt that it's the context which makes the people creative. And we see that in classrooms and context all the time, right? Which is, if you can create a space which is relatively risk-free for people to play and experiment, that there are no strong consequences of failure for your actions. I mean, so we can think of these contexts. In fact, I mean, there's some research that I've done with my students on this. Can you sort of look at a classroom and be able to say, oh, this classroom actually affords creativity while this one does not? And, it's not rocket science. Honestly, it's pretty common sense in some way, but clearly we understand one thing, that we know what prevents it from happening. So if you create high stakes testing, which puts teachers always on the edge saying, oh, my job or my my salary is at risk, or schools can be declared as failing schools. I mean, you create an environment that way, you are not going to get creativity and innovation, right? I mean, you have to create spaces where imagination is treasured and valued for itself. You create a space where multiple voices are treasured and valued, which is that if you have a different opinion, doesn't make you wrong. It just is the beginning of a conversation. I think that there is a lot of evidence we have now about how one can support and nurture. It's not something that you can teach, but it is something that can be nurtured and developed. The question is whether we create these environments, whether in school or otherwise, after school and other contexts, that allow for that to happen. And I think there's a lot that we can learn. This is where I think education can learn a lot from the arts and can learn a lot from fields like architecture and design and others, where if you think about architecture or graphic arts and so on, where there is a structured way to developing creativity, right? And why don't we have similar ways in thinking about whether it's in mathematics or in the sciences or in whatever? Can we bring some of that element of taking ownership over subject matter, building your own understanding there are multiple ways of approaching it? So there's a lot that we do know about it. I mean, the research on this is pretty standard and pretty strong. It's just that the implementation of it, and I think it comes back to this earlier question that had come up, which is that once you make something sort of big and large, it comes with a whole set of handbooks and policy structures and so on, which prevent that sort of grounds up innovation that you're talking about.
Yeah, that gets to a question that Javier posted in the chat too, and Javier asked that does this TSC as written sort of support what you're talking about, but it also seems very transactional. So is the TSC potentially a place for creativity or innovation, or is it just sort of a jobs program?
As I envision it could be a place for creativity and growth, and they're sort of holding a carrot in front of people, but that doesn't mean that things. I was about to come up with a really cool metaphor, but it doesn't quite fire. So I'll say, like, you can, just because something has a reward doesn't mean that it doesn't also have those other aspects and foster creativity and growth and everything that we would hope for. It definitely would come with bureaucracy too, obviously. So finding that balance would be tricky. But I do look to when I think about all of the programs that my friends have gone through, Peace Corps and that sort of thing. I think when those programs carry some flexibility, there's room. So I think it just depends on how it's developed. So, and since it's in my head, then I think it can be developed fairly well. If I were to create the larger version of it, there would have to be some grains in there to rub against. But I don't think that they would be in the conception of it. They would probably be in some of the implementation. Mm-hmm. If you ever see a larger version, you'll see that's exactly where my head goes with it. So you heard it here first.
Yeah, well, great questions continue to come in. So we're going to take a little swerve. Paul asks, Sarah has made me think of how a flash piece is similar to the condensed storytelling in songwriting. And do you see a parallel with that, Sarah?
Absolutely. In my own growth as a writer, I had started out as a short fiction writer. As a kid in high school and college, I went through all those classes, and I got to this point where I was writing shorter and shorter stories and just loving that challenge of trying to find the grain of truth in a story, and that ended up pushing me into music and songwriting and a music career where most of my songs are actually stories. Like it's all the storytelling muscle. So Flash is probably the closest thing to that, where you don't get to be, you have to choose the words very precisely in Flash, which is also very true of poetry and of songwriting, where when every word is being counted, every word has to pull more than its own weight. So there's, I do see a lot of similarity there. And then you get to the longer lengths and you can bring with them many of the tools of songwriting, which is also going to be a workshop I'm going to teach later in the summer through Kat Rambo's project, the Rambo School of Writing, or whatever I'm blanking on what she calls it, but bringing the techniques from songwriting into storytelling. I didn't pay Paul to set that up or anything.
So another question from Tracy. So Tracy asks, what are your favorite stories of utopias, and either successful utopias or failed utopias? And so I'm assuming that's for both of you. So go wild.
I can go first if you want while you're thinking. I'm going to blank on the name of the second one. I adore The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin, and and again, the grain that's rubbing against the people in that story. But I also adore every single story that's ever been written that pokes at that story and the flaws in it. I mean, in many ways, I think it's a perfect story, but I also think that it is a perfect story in that it allows people room to explore the edges of it. And there's been some fantastic explorations of the edges of it, including N.K. Jemisin's story, which is in her new collection, How Long Till Black Future Month, and I'm blanking on the name of the story and looking at the title as if I can come up with it. But it's another riff on the same thing. I think it's The Ones Who Stay and Fight, and I thought The Ones Who Stay and Fight was a really, really intriguing exploration of the same things, but with a different solution.
I was thinking, firstly, thank you for reminding me of One Who Walk Away from the Umbrellas, because that's one of my favorite stories of all time, for a range of reasons. But I was thinking, I was reading recently of the Lord of the Flies, and then there's this recent story that's emerging of these kids from Tonga who, and then it's another story, and then there is another layer on it of sort of a post-colonial layer that's sort of emerging about this Australian businessman who actually saved these kids, and he's the one who bought their stories, and that's the story that we get to hear. And I'm not sure I'm answering the utopian dystopian question as much as that it's these mess of ideas that I find like really interesting, right? So the point that you made, so I feel like now reading this, because I didn't know about the story that The One Who Stay and Fight. I want to go read that, because it's that the Golding sort of agenda was very appealing to me when I read it first. This new one is appealing in some other way, but the complications around all of them is like infinitely more appealing, and I think that it's that messiness of, it's neither utopia nor dystopia, it's this weird thing in between, which is what we're living right now, I guess, as well. And we've always lived in it. It's not that I'm not saying anything special about now as much as that's just how it is. And I think the conflicting threads that emerge are really intriguing and interesting.
Yeah, I agree completely. The messiness is a great way to put it. And that reminded me actually of the dichotomy that's also presented in Le Guin's The Dispossessed, which has the twin worlds that are that have different conceptions of in a similar way. So I think Le Guin is one of the best at just exploring those ideas and the messiness inherent.
Right.
Excellent. So, doing just sort of our final thought, as we talk about, this series being about, new definitions of community, I wonder if the two of you might speak a little bit to, what this story specifically has to tell us about community. How does it define it? And then, in the spirit of the story, what new questions open up once we have this idea of the community?
Do you want to go first?
Sure. I think, on the surface of it, you have these two, right? You have the commune and you have this wider world out there. What's interesting to me is like, what does this happens to this young person who's been raised in this and goes into that? And clearly they're going in with lots of hopes and dreams. And at some level, there is going to be that grain which is going to rub, because that's, again, the messiness of life. And so to me, that's sort of what keeps it keeps the story interesting. Because at the end, he's asking this question of himself, like, will I be transformed, or will, who's getting transformed here? And I think that sort of is the heart of this idea of community, because at some level, it's the individual. Each of us make up a community. Each of us is this individual, unique, but collectively we are, something, there is that tension between the person and the whole. And I think that this story sort of places that right at the middle there and says, like, what's happening? Where is this person going to end up, and how do they fit in? That's sort of interesting to me, and it leaves it unresolved, which is, I think, the way it should be, because it asks more questions. So that's what I feel is that the question we have to ask ourselves is that this balance between the individual and the collective. And we are seeing that tension right now, right? Should I wear a mask or not? I mean, am I wearing a mask for myself or am I wearing a mask for others? And what does it tell me about me and about others? What judgments do we make about each other? That's a strong individual versus community sort of distinction, right? And which communities we feel we belong to. Anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. All of that. And also, I was hoping to raise the question of, why do people separate themselves, and are you allowed to separate yourself from the larger community, and what does it mean to do that, and what do you gain and what do you lose? So I wanted to play with some of that as well, and even the mail carrier points out, I think at one point, unless I cut this, that they're not completely off the grid, that they're using some services, they're still getting mail, they're not, they exist in a world with others no matter what they do to remove themselves. So I think there's an idea of, I think you have to at some point acknowledge the world you live in and the community, the larger community around you. I would like to think, and I would like to imagine young people in that context asking questions about what the larger community is and what it is that they're missing and how they can engage and step back into that. And then everything you said.
No, that's the beauty of literature, is there are many readings, and that's what makes it fun.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for being here. Sarah and Punya, can you let people know where to find you and follow your work? Sarah, you want to go first?
Sure. I probably have to do a better job on keeping up on my website, but it does exist, sarahpinsker.com. It's not too out of date. And I'm pretty active on Twitter, so that's a good place, at Sarah Pinsker.
Same thing, first name, last name, website, and Twitter as well. I'm not as active on Twitter, but my website is pretty up to date. So it's punyamishra.com. And seriously, if you're interested in issues around learning futures and stuff like that, drop me a line. I reply to every email I get, for sure. Might take me a few days, but I will reply.
I've been taking notes, so I'll be hitting you up if I ever do make the novel version.
Thank you.
Excellent. And yeah, you can find us, the Center for Science and Imagination, also on Twitter, at ImaginationASU. You can visit our website. You can catch up on all of the previous Us in Flux stories and conversations. That website is csi.asu.edu. And our next story for Us in Flux is a Cyber Cuscuta Manifesto by Regina Kanyu Wang. We're going to publish that on Thursday, June 25th. And then we'll have a chat with Regina and our colleague, Athena Aktipis, on Monday, June 29th. So look forward to that. And thank you once again, Sarah, Punya, for joining us. Thank all of you for watching. And yeah, we'll see you again. Until then, stay well, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.